The morning began as usual in this strange city, where the streets were filled with slow-moving figures in business suits. Suits that hadn't been washed in a long time, but still created the illusion of order. The illusion that life went on as before. People used to live here, but now only their pale copies remained, repeating the rituals of a forgotten civilization day after day. Day after day, they boarded buses driven by dead drivers along routes learned long ago in another reality. Reality no longer existed, but the city continued to function by inertia, like a clockwork mechanism without a master. The masters had all disappeared, and the apprentices remained, copying movements without understanding their meaning, merely following ancient impulses of memory. Almost nothing remained of the memory of how to be human, only fragments reflected in the glass windows of empty stores. Stores where zombies lined up at the cash registers, holding goods that no one had paid for in many months. Months had passed since the last living person left the city, leaving it to its new owners with their strange habits. Habits that included morning coffee in empty cafes, where zombie baristas mechanically poured brown liquid into cups. All the inhabitants of the city moved mechanically, their actions devoid of meaning, but perfectly preserving the form of human life. The traffic lights worked perfectly, even though the cars had long been parked on the side of the road, and their owners had forgotten why these iron boxes were needed. Boxes of office supplies stood on desks in high-rise buildings, where zombie clerks typed meaningless text on keyboards. The text had no content, but the sound of the keys created an atmosphere of work, an atmosphere that calmed the collective consciousness of the dead. There were many dead, filling every corner of the city, creating the appearance of a population, even though that population had long since stopped breathing. They did not need to breathe, nor did they need to eat real food, but instinct compelled them to gather in the dining rooms 3 times a day, regularly. Regular meetings were held at City Hall, where zombie officials sat at a long table, staring at each other silently with empty eyes. They nodded their heads silently, imitating agreement or disagreement, although not a single thought ever arose in their atrophied brains. The city never stopped moving. Even at night, figures roamed the streets, not needing sleep like living people used to. Once upon a time, the laughter of children could be heard in the playgrounds, but now the little zombies just swung on the swings without making a sound. There was almost no sound anywhere. The city was plunged into silence, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the occasional clatter of objects falling accidentally. Sometimes zombies accidentally dropped things they were holding, but they did not pick them up, continuing on their way to some unknown destination automatically. Streetlights turned on automatically at dusk, the system working properly even though no one had maintained it in a long time. A long-abandoned power plant on the outskirts of the city still generated energy, controlled by computers and dead operators. Operators who once knew every button and lever, but now just stood at the consoles, touching them at random with their fingers. The zombies chose their direction of movement at random every morning, but strangely enough, they always ended up where they were supposed to be according to the schedule. Everyone followed the schedule, as if an invisible force controlled the city, forcing the dead to play at life with astonishing precision all the time. School doors opened constantly, and zombie children with briefcases entered, sat down at their desks, and stared at the blackboard for hours on end. One after another, several zombie teachers wrote formulas and words on the blackboards with chalk, which were completely meaningless to the dead students. It was completely unclear where this program of action came from, but every zombie knew its place in the city system exactly. At exactly noon, the siren at the old factory emitted a long howl, and everyone froze for a few seconds before continuing on their way. The movement did not stop at the hospital, where zombie doctors walked through the wards, checking the pulse of zombie patients lying motionless in their beds. They lay motionless for days, but sometimes they got up and left, making room for new visitors to this theater of slow absurdity. There was no slow decay. The city seemed frozen in time, retaining the outward appearance of civilization without any of its inner substance. It was strange to watch the zombies standing in line at bus stops, letting others go ahead according to some incomprehensible hierarchy. Hierarchies existed here too. Some zombies wore more expensive suits, others wore simple clothes, and this silently determined their status. The authority of the zombie mayor was tacitly acknowledged. He would sometimes step out onto the balcony of the town hall and stand there, looking out at the square below. He was an imposing figure in a worn tuxedo with a chain around his neck, a symbol of authority that no one ever challenged. There were never any riots or disturbances. All the zombies followed the unwritten rules that were deeply ingrained in their collective memory forever. Deep in the basements of old buildings, groups of zombies would sometimes gather, standing in a circle and swaying to the beat of inaudible music for a long time. They could stand like this for a long time until one of them started moving towards the exit, and then everyone else followed the leader. Anyone who was the first to move in a certain direction could become the leader, and the rest would follow him obediently through the streets of the city. Ghost towns, where every building held traces of former life. Photographs on the walls, children's drawings, forgotten books on dusty shelves. They lay there for years, no one opening them, but the zombies would sometimes pick them up and stare blankly at the pages for a minute. A minute later, the book would fall to the floor, and the zombie would continue on its way, forgetting that it had just been holding the object in its hands. There were many objects scattered around the city, but no one cleaned them up, and gradually the streets became covered with a layer of things from a past life. Life was no longer there, but its imitation continued daily, creating an illusion for non-existent observers from the outside. There was no outside. The city was surrounded by high fences that had once been erected for quarantine and now simply stood there. They stood rusty and crooked, but the zombies never tried to go beyond their limits, as if an invisible border held the dead back. The dead were growing in number because sometimes rare living wanderers entered the city and quickly became part of the population. They quickly lost their humanity, becoming infected with a virus that gradually turned them into obedient performers of meaningless rituals. Gradually, memories of their former lives faded, and the new zombies took their places in the city system as if they had always been there. There were times when the living tried to resist, but the virus worked not only through bites, but also through the air, silently and imperceptibly. It quietly penetrated the lungs, altering the chemistry of the brain, erasing emotions, and replacing them with mechanical patterns of behavior that were alien and cold. The streets were cold in winter, but the zombies did not feel the temperature. They walked in summer clothes through the snow without any obvious discomfort. There was no obvious difference between the seasons for them. Only the change in the length of the day affected the duration of their activity slightly. A little light penetrated the windows of abandoned apartments, where zombie families sat at tables pretending to eat dinner with empty plates in front of them. They resembled wax figures in a museum, frozen in everyday poses, but sometimes one of them would get up and go somewhere. The zombies were always drawn somewhere, some internal compass pointing the way, and they followed it without question or doubt. There were no signs of decay. The virus somehow preserved the tissue, keeping the appearance almost human, strangely. It was strange to see zombies that had looked the same for years, not aging or changing, as if time had stopped in this city. A city where there were no births or deaths in the usual sense, only the transformation of the rare living into new members of the society of the dead. Dead, but functioning, capable of imitating complex actions, although their consciousness had long since faded, leaving only basic programs alive. These programs were alive in the sense that they had adapted to changes in the environment, and the city had slowly evolved in its deadness, a deadness that paradoxically resembled life more than the existence of many living people in other places who had lost the meaning of being. The existence of zombies was simple and clear. Follow the route, imitate actions, maintain form, and the collective will function as a single organism. The unified organism of the city pulsated in its slow rhythm, its artery streets filled with streams of zombies in the morning and emptied in the evening, as expected. The cycles of day and night, work and rest, repeated predictably, although rest for zombies meant simply standing motionless in their apartments. This motionless state lasted for several hours, then movement began again, and the city woke up to a new day that was always the same. The days, always identical, created a sense of eternity, as if the city existed outside of time, in a bubble of its own closed reality. Closed and self-sufficient, this reality did not need contact with the outside world, which may have also become empty. Empty but orderly, the zombie city was a model of organization, where each element knew its place and function without instructions from above. From above, the empty windows of skyscrapers looked down on the anthill of streets, where thousands of figures moved in predictable patterns every day in sync. The zombies turned their heads in sync when someone new passed by, their empty eyes fixed on the movement, but expressing no interest whatsoever. There was no curiosity left in their minds, only basic recognition. Friend or foe, danger or safety, move or stop. Simple commands only. Only occasionally did the system malfunction, when a zombie suddenly began to move chaotically, bumping into walls and other inhabitants of the city. The city machine usually quickly corrected such errors, surrounding the malfunctioning element and somehow reprogramming it with collective touches. Through collective efforts, the zombies maintained the functioning of the infrastructure. Some repaired wires, some cleaned up trash, and some intuitively controlled traffic lights. They intuitively understood the necessity of these actions, although their understanding was not intellectual but instinctive, encoded in their altered genes. Genes that the virus had rewritten, creating a new species that parasitized on the remnants of human civilization and its complex technical achievements. They could not create new, complex mechanisms, but they knew how to maintain existing ones, following the learned movements of former operators precisely. In the same way, zombie chefs prepared food in restaurant kitchens, although the dishes turned out strange because they could not distinguish flavors at all. Taste was completely unimportant to the dead visitors, who mechanically chewed and swallowed, performing the ritual of eating without pleasure. There was no pleasure in their existence, nor was there suffering. Their emotional spectrum narrowed to zero, leaving a void inside. Inside each zombie was this emptiness, but on the outside they created the appearance of a full life, and the city looked almost alive from a distance. From afar it could be mistaken for an ordinary settlement, only too quiet and too orderly, without the chaos of a living society. There was no longer a society, only individuals connected by a collective unconscious that controlled everyone simultaneously through strange, invisible channels. Strange phenomena sometimes occurred. All the zombies in the city would stop for a moment, freezing in their poses, then continue moving. This movement could have been synchronization, an exchange of information through a mechanism unknown to science, possibly through virus spores in the dense air. The dense and humid air of the city, where fog often rose from the ground, enveloping the streets and giving everything a ghostly morning appearance. The morning fog hid the flaws of the imitation, making the zombies look like people rushing to work until you got close to them. Up close, you could see the deathly pallor of their skin, the lack of facial expressions, the mechanical nature of their movements, but from a distance, the illusion of life always held up perfectly. This illusion was always maintained because the zombies intuitively understood the importance of preserving form, the form of human existence without true content. There was no true content left when the last living person turned into a zombie and the city came under the complete control of the dead. A new order was finally established, where the main law was to imitate life, copying its external manifestations down to the smallest detail. Accurate copying even included meaningless rituals. Zombies celebrated holidays by gathering in the square and standing there for hours in complete silence. The only place where there was no complete silence was in the subway, where trains still ran on schedule, controlled by an autopilot system and dead train drivers. Train drivers who sat in their cabs with their hands on the levers, even though all the work was done by computers, and the zombie people were now just decoration. Now the whole city was a backdrop, a performance without an audience, where the actors had forgotten that they were playing roles and had merged with their characters forever. Forever stuck in this loop of repeating days, the zombies created a stable society devoid of human conflicts, ambitions, desires, and fears. They had no human weaknesses, nor did they have any strength, only a mechanical existence within the framework of ancient rules established by someone. Ancient or sewn in by a virus, these rules worked flawlessly, creating order out of chaos, an effective system out of separate dead elements, effective but meaningless to an outside observer. Although the zombies themselves did not need meaning, they simply existed, obeying the program. A program that no one wrote consciously, but which arose naturally from the collective memory of human life, blurred. Blurred, like an old photograph where the details have faded, but the general contours remain, and the zombies followed these contours, filling in the gaps with random actions. Actions that only seemed random, but in fact obeyed some hidden logic, inaccessible to the understanding of living outside observers. There had been no outside observers for a long time. Everyone who came to the city became part of it, joining the ranks of silent ritual performers. Rituals of a civilization that had died, but left behind perfect copycats capable of maintaining the appearance of life forever, as long as the infrastructure worked. The infrastructure gradually wore out, but the zombies learned to repair it, passing on skills through touch and observation, creating a semblance of professional continuity. Continuity without training in the traditional sense, knowledge was passed on directly through contact, as if the zombies were parts of a single distributed organism. Distributed intelligence was sufficient to maintain the system, but not to develop it, and the city froze at a certain point in its evolution, frozen forever. Frozen at the moment when the last living person lost consciousness and joined the ranks of the dead, completing the transformation of the population once and for all. It had finally turned into an open-air museum of humanity, where the exhibits were the former people themselves, and there were no curators. There was a strange feeling of peace in this city, where there were no screams, arguments, laughter, or crying, only the quiet shuffling of thousands of feet that had walked the same routes for years, treading invisible paths in the asphalt with their endless, monotonous, slow movement. Slow and inevitable, like the passage of time, which no longer changed anything in the zombie city, where every day was a copy of the previous one. The previous and the next, in an endless series of identical cycles, where the only change was the slow, physical destruction of buildings and roads. Physical destruction was compensated for by repairs. Zombie builders repaired cracks and holes, keeping the city in a condition acceptable for their minimal needs. They had few minimal needs: space to move around, imitation of functions, preservation of the general structure of society without further development. No further development was foreseen. The city had reached its final state, stable and unchanging, existing somewhere beyond progress and regression. Somewhere between life and death, in this gray zone, lived the new masters of the planet, who would eventually take over the remaining territories. The territories outside the city were unknown to its inhabitants. The zombies were not interested in exploration. They had enough familiar space for a full existence. The full cycle of their activities, moving along routes, imitating work, gathering in public places, returning to their dwellings, standing motionless at night. Their motionless nighttime standing resembled sleep. But the zombies' eyes remained open, staring into the darkness or at the wall in front of them with a blank gaze. A gaze that reflected nothing. No thoughts or emotions, only emptiness filling the place where real life had once beaten. Real life remained only in the memory of buildings, in abandoned belongings, in photographs on the walls, silent witnesses to a past that had completely disappeared, completely vanished, but strangely resurrected in the actions of zombies who were living archaeology, a museum of humanity in motion, frozen in a paradox. Paradoxically, it was this freeze that allowed culture to be preserved in its external manifestations, although its spirit died along with the people. Forever? This question made no sense to the zombies, who had no philosophy, only actions repeated mechanically day after day. Mechanically, but with surprising accuracy, creating the impression that the city was alive, breathing, functioning, although all this was just an empty, perfect simulation. Empty inside, but whole on the outside, this simulation could fool any outside observer if they didn't get close enough. Close to the truth about the city, which was simple and terrible. There was no one left alive here, only copies, imitators, zombie actors forever. Forever stuck in their roles, they continued the performance that no one watched except themselves. But they knew nothing. They knew nothing about the fact that they were no longer human, that their consciousness had faded, that they were only shadows playing at life endlessly. Endless and meaningless to an outside observer. But for the zombies themselves, this process was all they had left of their former existence. An existence that continued in a new form, without pain, joy, hope, or fear, only in the constant repetition of the patterns learned from the ancients. Ancient, like civilization itself, patterns that the zombies preserved with religious zeal, not understanding their meaning, but feeling the importance of observance. Observance of the rules was enough to maintain order, and the zombie city functioned better than many living cities, where chaos destroyed the structure. The structure of zombie society was maintained instinctively. Everyone knew their place, and there was no competition, envy, greed, or any other human vices whatsoever. A completely new society arose on the ruins of the old one, a society of the dead who imitated the living better than the living sometimes imitated themselves. At times, it seemed that zombies understood the essence of human life more deeply than humans themselves, reducing it to simple actions without unnecessary meaning. They did not seek meaning because they could not. Their brains functioned at a basic level, but that was enough to maintain the city system. A system that had become self-sufficient, self-reproducing through the infection of rare visitors, self-sustaining through the collective efforts of all zombies simultaneously. At the same time, they were individuals and parts of a whole, a paradox that did not bother their consciousness because consciousness in the usual sense did not exist. There was only functioning, movement, imitation, endless repetition of memorized actions, creating the illusion of life for non-existent outside viewers. There were no outside viewers because the whole world had probably already turned into similar zombie cities where copies of people played at civilization. A civilization of the dead, which, paradoxically, was more stable than the civilization of the living with its wars, crises, and unpredictable, constant chaos. The only constant was the existence of zombies, their unchanging rhythm of life, their loyalty to learned patterns, their collective memory of humanity blurred. Blurred, but sufficient to preserve the form of urban life, albeit devoid of content, soul, meaning, and everything that is truly human. True humanity no longer existed in this city. Only its imprints remained on dead faces and in mechanical actions, constantly repeating themselves. Constantly repeating, creating the illusion of continuity, of the continuity of history, even though history ended on the day the last human being died physically. Physically, they were all dead, but they continued to move, work, and exist in their strange form of non-life, which was more stable than real life. Real life no longer existed in this city, but its perfect copy functioned flawlessly, like a clockwork mechanism. Precise and predictable, the zombie city was a model of order achieved at the cost of losing everything human, all emotions and higher thoughts. Only the most basic functions remained: movement, imitation, maintenance of the system, and that was enough for the collective to continue its endless existence. Endless, as long as the infrastructure worked, as long as the virus preserved the bodies, as long as nothing unexpected happened that could destroy this fragile balance. Established between life and death, between chaos and order, between human and non-human, the zombie city existed at this point of equilibrium. An equilibrium that seemed eternal, but was only a temporary state in the long history of the planet, where species replaced each other cyclically, like the seasons, like day and night, like life and death, and zombies were a new stage of evolution, a post-human form of existence. Existence without consciousness, but with functionality, without a soul, but with behavior, without life, but with movement, another strange paradox of nature. Strange and frightening for a hypothetical observer, but for the zombies themselves, it was a natural state, the only one they now knew. Now that the memory of what they had been as humans had been completely erased, they simply existed, asking no questions, never seeking answers. There was never any doubt about the correctness of their actions, because doubt requires consciousness, and there was absolutely nothing left of consciousness in them. Nothing human except form, except appearance, except imitative actions that created the illusion of continuing life for everyone around them. All around them were the same zombies, and no one noticed the strangeness of the situation, because only those who retained the ability to reflect could notice it. No one in the city had the ability to reflect. Everyone was the same. Everyone was part of the system. Everyone was a zombie, including those who had retained the ability to speak. Some retained the ability to speak in the form of individual phrases repeated mechanically, greetings, apologies, and expressions of gratitude that had no meaning, only the form of politeness. Politeness that zombies observed automatically, letting each other pass in doorways, giving up seats on public transport, maintaining the outward appearances of a dead society. Dead but functioning, the city continued to exist, and no one inside it was aware of the tragedy, because awareness requires consciousness, which was absent. Absent in everyone, including the one who could tell this story, but he too was a zombie, an actor just as empty inside. An actor in a play without an audience, where everyone was an actor and no one was a spectator, a closed system with no exit and no beginning. There was no definite beginning to this story, nor was there an end, only an endless present where zombies played out eternity in one go. Days turned into nights, and the city continued its existence, slowly, methodically, meaninglessly, but with surprising accuracy, reproducing an empty human society. Empty, like a shell without content, like a form without substance, like movement without purpose. The zombie city was the perfect monument to humanity that had completely disappeared. Completely disappeared, but leaving behind these strange heirs who preserved everything external and lost everything internal forever. Completely. Absolutely.